Jonathan Rauch believes Christianity can help fix what's wrong with the country. We're polarized, we're deeply suspicious of one another, but also we're just really crappy at performing the functions on which he says our constitutional order depends. In his new book, he makes the case that Christianity is an important part of fixing the crisis. And the book begins with a conversion story, but not the one you might be expecting.
I was born in Phoenix, Arizona, in 1960 at a very different time. And I knew from an early age that I was different from the people around me. I was Jewish in an overwhelmingly Christian society. I also knew that despite my Judaism, the idea of God just didn't make sense to me. You know, a supernatural being that creates this whole universe, yet cares about us and performs miracles. I just couldn't figure out why that made any sense. And the third thing was that also from that very early age, I was experiencing strange obsessions and attractions to boys. I also knew something else, which is that Christianity had no use for me at all. In those days, you couldn't turn on the car radio on a Sunday morning and twist the dial without literally hearing a sermon preaching that homosexuality was God's curse. And yet I saw the hypocrisy of the church when I got a little bit older. So I came to think that as a Jew and an atheist and a proto-gay person, that Christianity was about hypocrisy and cruelty and bigotry. And I was not unjustified in thinking those things. But at age 18, I entered college, and the fates paired me with a freshman year roommate named Mark McIntosh from Chicago. And Mark was different from anyone that I had ever met before, because he was a Christian who not only talked the talk, but he also walked the walk. You know, he wasn't a plaster saint. He had a sense of humor and got angry and irritated and everything like that. But he led his life constantly thinking about Christianity and what it meant to him and how it would shape his life. And he would talk about C.S. Lewis in particular. And initially, I kind of dismissed him as God Squad, and I have to admit I was pretty rude about him. And yet, he made a deep impression on me. For the first time, I saw that maybe Christianity was something that could be elevating, and something that was culturally different than what I had thought, and different from what I saw in the world around me. Knowing Mark didn't convert me. I'm still an atheist, a homosexual, and a Jew. But it set me on a long journey of gradually over time becoming more open to understanding, trying to understand faith generally and Christianity specifically, trying to appreciate it and the power of its moral vision. And ultimately, it led to the book that I've just written, which is framed as an apology to Mark McIntosh for some of my insensitivity and some of my own ignorance about faith. An act of penitence.
This is RadioWest. I'm Doug Fabrizio. Rauch's new book is called Cross Purposes. And I should say it's more than just an apology. What he does is explore how the Christian virtues he saw in his friend Mark could serve as what he describes as a load-bearing wall for institutions that are buckling under the weight of division and hostility. part of this is a critique of both the left and the right, how each in turn has imported religious zeal into politics and exported politics into religion. And I'm afraid I've buried the lead here. One of the examples of American Christianity that could be a model for a way forward, Rauch says, is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But let's back up. We began our conversation with what Rauch says is the dumbest thing he ever wrote.
As I gradually grew in my respect for Christians that I knew, nonetheless, I remained very secular in my orientation. And I basically agreed with the secular folks and the new atheists who kind of thought, well, some people may need religion, but wouldn't we all be better off without it? And in 2003, I wrote an article touting what I called apatheism, which is a jokey combination of apathy and theism. And it celebrated the rise of secularism in America and said, isn't it great that people are just losing interest in faith? They're just giving up on it. They're not militant atheists. They're not having a big conniption about it. They're just not bothering. And that's going to make America more like Scandinavia. Will be more enlightened and more relaxed about things, because faith, after all, religion is the most divisive and often dogmatic component of everyday life. And, in 2015 in The Atlantic, I confidently predicted that Donald J. Trump would never be president.
Yeah.
But that article in 2003 was officially the dumbest thing I ever wrote.
Let's talk about the reason it was. The thesis of the book in general is that something happened to American Christianity, which you say in the book has made Christianity less able or less willing, or less able and willing, to support the liberal democracy of which it's a part. So we'll get to the kind of connection between Christianity and liberal democracy, but when did this idea come to you? I'm interested in when you found that direct through line from the principles in Christianity and democracy, because that connection is really important here.
Well, the connection between Christianity, the principles of Christianity, and the principles of democracy came very recently. Actually, it came in the course of working on this book. The bigger transformation, the earlier transformation, is what I didn't know when I wrote The Dumbest Thing I Ever Wrote in 2003, was that right at that exact time, the United States was embarking on exactly the experiment that I proposed. A wave of secularization and what's been called de-churching, unlike anything we have seen before in American history. I've got, there are facts and figures out the wazoo, but for example, just in the 14 years before 2022, these are very recent development, Doug. In just those 14 years, 40 million Americans stop attending religious services, virtually doubling the number of Americans who don't attend services. Church membership falls from 70% in 2000, which is basically what it was throughout the whole 20th century since the start of polling, to by 2020, only 20 years later, it's under half.
Yeah.
And I could go on and on with these numbers.
I was struck by a lot of one of them was the fact that at least 86 churches close on net every week.
Yep. And they get, the ones that are there get smaller and less well-funded. Here's one more, just to get a sense of the scale of this thing. In 2007, not all that long ago, 78% of Americans, of white Americans, said they were Christian. 14 years later, 2021, it's down to 63%. That's a 15-point change in 14 years. 1 percentage point a year. I mean, you just don't see social trends of fundamental indicators of that magnitude. And over that same period, where are they going? 1 percentage point a year increase in people who are unaffiliated with any religion, so-called nones, N-O-N-E-S.
Yeah.
So in 2003, that hadn't happened yet, but it was about to happen, and I would have said that's hunky-dory.
Right.
Except it doesn't work out very well.
Yeah.
Over the same period of time, social indicators like depression and anxiety skyrocket, especially among the young. Indicators of connection, things like loneliness, social isolation, skyrocket. More concerning than that, people start looking for substitute religions.
Yeah.
It turns out they drift away from Christianity, but they still need a sense of identity, some purpose. But they turn to secular alternatives that, a lot of them are self-help or things like Soul Cycle or Wicca or crystals or self-improvement, which don't convey basic values in a fundamental way. They're kind of about self-empowerment. Or even worse than that, they turn to these highly partisan, angry political movements and identities like wokeness and MAGA and QAnon, and they bestow these movements with almost religious zealotry. So every election becomes apocalyptic, fight between good and evil, and the other side is evil, and we need to crush them. And that begins to make our politics toxic, and that starts making the country ungovernable. And here we are in 2025. Yeah. And I'm going, my gosh, I did not realize, stupid me, I did not realize Christianity is a load-bearing wall in our democracy. And when it caves in, a lot of other things start caving in with it.
What are the aspects of Christianity that are so important? I mean, you're going to hear from, and you clearly already have, from your fellow secular humanists who say that's absurd to say you have to be Christian to have a sense of morality. People don't need that. But you are talking about something that is distinctive to Christianity, that is valuable to a larger society. You write about the communal functions of religion being really important and really difficult to replace. So what is it about Christianity, the mechanisms, the framework, that whether you believe or not are really important to, in this case, American democracy?
Well, two things there. One we'll come to later, and that's the three specific fundamental teachings of Christianity which are essential to democracy. Yeah. And I think you indicated we'll get there.
We will, yes.
So more generically, what is it about faith and about Christianity, which is America's predominant and founding faith? What is it about that that's so important? Well, one thing is that, yeah, it's true, instrumentally giving people an anchor for their values, a place where they can gather for communal activity, meet others who are different from themselves, socialize their children into those values and beliefs, have a sense of transcendence, something more important in life than just getting to work on time or winning the next election. Yeah. All of that is essential. And it turns out we should accept no substitutes, because the substitutes that people thought would work, Soul Cycle, turn out not to be able really to do any of those things. So that's the instrumental answer. But one of the claims I make in this book, which it's a little bit bold, but see if people will go with me on this. So I say this as a scientific materialist.
Yeah.
I don't believe in God. I don't think there is such a thing. But I do believe that there are fundamental questions that people and societies usually want answers to, that scientific materialism just can't answer. One of those questions is, why am I here?
Yeah.
What meaning does my life have? Am I more than just a clump of cells that coincidentally accumulated and then in the blink of an eye will disappear? Because if that's all I am, why bother? What is this about? And that's what I call the problem of mortality.
Yeah.
What does it mean to have this brief period of life and then be dead forever? And then the second thing that scientific materialists can't answer, I think inherently, is what's the source of morality? How can we make claims about right and wrong, just, unjust, good and evil that go beyond human preferences? How can we anchor those things in something that transcends ourselves? So all of the world's great faiths have answers to those questions. And I'm not saying that people need to believe those answers to be good, or that I believe those answers, and I think I'm reasonably good. But I am saying that a whole lot of people, very understandably, feel a need to anchor their morality and their meaning in something larger than themselves. And that you need religion to do that, and that the great Abrahamic religions in our society, Judaism, but really especially Christianity, are how you do that. So people then say, well, look, John, so you're one of those people saying you're too smart to need religion or God, but you're glad all those stupid people believe it anyway because it's good for society if they do.
Yeah.
And I think I'm really not saying that. I think what I'm saying is that scientific materialism, secularism, it's the only philosophy that can give a coherent account of the material world, in other words, science.
Right.
And it's the only philosophy that can really answer the question of why evil exists. None of the religions have been able to answer that question, but it can't answer the other two. And so secularism and faith are like, if you imagine two boards, two 2x4s, neither one will stand up in a stable way by itself. But if you lean them against each other, they will stand up. So these two things, faith and secularism, are both incomplete. And they each have something to offer the other. And society, and I think most human hearts, are actually more whole if they can have both of those things. I can't. But I don't experience that. I used to when I met Mark McIntosh. I thought that made me smarter than religious people because I don't need their dumb crutch. But getting to know him and then other Christians over time, I began to see that their lives are enriched by their belief in God in ways that mine isn't, and that they were given a gift of faith that I just don't have. I'm not wired that way. I'm perfectly happy. I don't need to convert. Jesus is not knocking on my heart right now. I tell people it's a little bit like being colorblind. I'm fine the way I am, but there are depths in life. There are human emotions, spirituality, this sense of enchantment that can come with faith that I have not experienced.
That's Jonathan Rauch. He's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. His new book is called Cross Purposes, Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy. We'll take a break. Come back in a moment. You're listening to Radio West. This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. Today in the program, we have with us the public intellectual Jonathan Rauch, who believes Christianity can help fix what's wrong with the country. So we're polarized, we're deeply suspicious of one another, but Rauch says we're also just not good at performing the functions on which our constitutional order depends. And he says there's always been this implicit bargain between American Christianity and American democracy. And Christianity was important to the founders, he says, because it teaches virtue, and virtue makes Americans more governable and peaceable. His book is called Cross Purposes. I want to get to the idea contained in the title of the book, the idea of cross purposes, the idea of this broken bargain with democracy. Because as you put it in the book, you didn't appreciate the implicit bargain, that's how you put it, between American democracy and American Christianity. And this gets us to the founders of the country. And it seems like this is one of the points that you're making, that the founders believed Christianity was important for stabilizing Republican government. And it's this idea of Christianity providing that stability that makes this relevant today, like today. Say a little bit more about that part, about the stability part that the founders saw in Christianity, not just the sort of the doctrine, but that framework that they saw.
Yeah. It's something more even than stability. So we know because the founders all told us with emphasis. Washington said it in his farewell address. Madison, the father of the Constitution, said it. Adams very famously said that our Constitution is only suited for a virtuous and religious people.
Yeah.
What they meant by that was not that this is a Christian nation or that you have to be a Christian to be a good citizen of America. In fact, they specifically rejected that view. They separated the church from the state, which was a radical idea in their time. No one had done that before. And they specifically omitted from the founding doctrine any mention of Jesus or Christianity. And that was controversial at the time because a lot of people said, wait, why isn't that in there?
Yeah.
So they did not want to say you have to be Christian or American has to be Christian. So what did they say? They said, look, we're giving you the forms of Republican government. We're giving you a constitution and a Declaration of Independence. But those things are not self-sufficient because they rely on a substrate of what they called Republican virtues. That is to say, those systems only function in a republic where there's an amount of virtues like being lawful, respect for the law, being civic, respect for other people, being truthful, respect for knowledge and facts, getting civically educated, so the electorate needs to be well-informed. Those things and other things, they said, are necessary to cultivate, or this system, it doesn't matter what it says in the Constitution, this system will cave in. And they said, in order to get that substrate of virtue, we can't give you that. Liberalism cannot give you that. It needs to come from civil society. And by that, they meant, of course, family and school and civic organizations. But they meant very predominantly Christianity.
Yeah.
What they were assuming, and really, I think, implicitly assigning the church to do, was cultivate those virtues which are implicit in Christianity, actually explicit in Christianity, which will also support our republic. Because if you don't, we can't. That's one of the things that's so wrong about the post-liberals that we talked about earlier. They blame liberalism for not fostering these core virtues, to which the answer is, you know that because we told you since the time of John Locke, 400 years ago. We've been telling you that's your job. We can't do it, but you need to. So that's the implicit bargain. They couldn't assign that to Christians. That would be presumptuous and impossible. But they did hope for that from Christians, and they did need that from Christians.
One of the things you do in the book is you describe the condition of certain types of Christianity, kind of like the gradients, I guess, of Christianity. And I kind of wanted to work through these. Let's start with thin Christianity. What is thin Christianity exactly?
A faith gets thin in the sense I mean when it loses its cultural distinctiveness. And it begins importing more from the surrounding culture by way of values than it's exporting to the culture. And that means if it just starts to reflect the external society, it becomes too weak to do the job that the founders intended. It becomes just a consumer choice or a lifestyle option. And people drift away. And that's what happened, according to sociologists of religion, to the mainline churches, the ecumenical churches. That's the Lutherans and the United Methodists and the Episcopal Church during the 20th century. These were massively important institutions in 1950 and when I was born. In those days, when you met someone new, often your introductory question wasn't where are you from or what do you do for a living. It was where do you go to church? Those institutions are now culturally virtually irrelevant. They pop up now and then, as when Bishop Buddy in Washington gives a sermon that offends the president.
Yeah.
But for the most part, they're not even heard of, and they're shadows of what they were, both in terms of their cultural impact and their membership, which is, by the way, lamentable because there's so many wonderful things in those mainline traditions.
So what is it how is it that Christianity, I guess what part of the cultural trade deficit, that's how you describe it in the book, how much of that is the church contributing to? Let me read something you include in the book. This is from the president of the Fuller Theological Seminary. This is Mark Labberton. He wrote this, I think this was in 2017. He wrote, "The church is in one of its deepest moments of crisis, not because of some election result." Now, mind you, that was written in 2017, so you can just imagine what election he's talking about. Not just because of some election result, he writes, but because of what has been exposed to be the poverty of the American church in its capacity to be able to see and love and serve and engage in ways in which we simply failed to do. What is he saying there?
Well, I think he's talking about a couple things. It just so happens that only yesterday I did a podcast interview with Mark Labberton, now,
Wow.
by the way, the former president of Fuller Theological Seminary. And we talked about this very thing, so I can say with a little bit of authority. Yeah, he was talking about the thin church, but that's old news. Can we talk for a minute about the sharp church?
For sure. That's where we're headed, yes.
That's where he headed as well, and that's where the real crisis is right now. So as the ecumenical churches faded to being now only about 13% of the white population. We're talking about white Protestantism here. The black church is a whole different story that I don't get into.
Right.
So even while the ecumenical church has faded, the evangelical church thrived, and it was culturally distinctive. It planted its feet against, for example, the sexual revolution and abortion and homosexuality. It stayed grounded in Scripture, something that had not really happened in the ecumenical church. And it was countercultural in that it projected a firm sense of its own values. And those are things that a faith really needs to do. It has to be countercultural, different from the surrounding culture. And it gained members. It seemed like it was growing and growing. And the story everyone told is, well, America's an exceptional country because it's so faith-based, but faith is moving out of the ecumenical church into the evangelical church. And that's the reality we thought we lived in 2003 when I wrote The Dumbest Thing Ever. However, since then it has been the evangelical church which has collapsed. It is the source primarily of the declining numbers we're talking about. People are fleeing from it. So what happened there?
Right.
So the story of the ecumenical churches is a story of one kind of secularization, which is when the church just basically takes on the attributes of the surrounding secular culture. The evangelical church is the second big story of secularization. But it took on different aspects of the surrounding culture. You know, instead of taking on sort of progressive causes as the thing it would organize around,
or
rather
social
than the Bible,
justice,
social justice and all those other things, it aligned itself with the Republican Party in a quest for power. Now, this is not new. This starts in the era of Reagan and continues apace. Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson are all figures there, but it really turbocharges in this century. And then it double turbocharges in 2016 when evangelicals, after some initial reluctance, embrace a figure who is as un-Christ-like as you can possibly imagine, but who offers them power. That's explicitly what he says. If you elect me, you will have power. Now, if you remember your Bible, you know that Jesus was offered power by Satan. Satan said, if you'll bow down to me and be loyal to me, you'll have dominion over the entire earth. And Jesus says, get away from me, Satan. Evangelicals made the opposite choice. And they said, yes, we want power. And yes, we will give this earthly figure, this worldly, un-Christ-like figure, our loyalty in exchange for power. And that's what they did. It wasn't in 2024, for lack of other alternatives. Mike Pence, who is a seriously decent man and a very good Christian, and at least as conservative on the issues as Donald Trump, was running. Evangelicals didn't care. They wanted Trump. So Trump is the final emanation of this long gamble evangelicals make. The gamble is that they can enter politics, partisan politics, and that they will influence politics more than politics will influence the church. And that's a gamble they lose. The church becomes increasingly, evangelicalism begins to lose the members who are most interested in the gospel of Jesus. And it begins to shrink as that happens. A lot of people don't want that from a church. As Russell Moore, the editor of Christianity Today, says, if you want to know why young people are fleeing the church, if all we give them is a choice between politicization and secularization, they'll choose one or the other.
Yeah.
And you can get those things outside the church. So those people leave the church. Others come in who are this strange phenomenon of non-church-going evangelicals. They now make up 1 in 8. And these are people who view evangelicalism and Christianity as a political marker.
Jonathan Rauch. His new book is Cross Purposes, Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy. We'll take another break and come back in a moment. You're listening to Radio West. This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. Back now to our conversation with Jonathan Rauch. We're talking about his book, Cross Purposes, Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy. So this leads us to the reason that so many people around here in Utah are paying attention to the ideas in your book, because, spoiler alert, you have identified as one of the models, as a better path for Christianity, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Let's begin with Dallin Oaks. President Oaks is in the first presidency of the church. I'll just tell you, most people listening know that, of course. But your idea of Mormonism being the antidote to that thin and sharp Christianity started with Dallin Oaks. When you heard him speak, this was in 2021. Tell us about that.
I'd love to, but minor correction.
Oh, okay.
If you don't mind, can I take it back to 2015?
Sure, of course. Yeah.
So, as people have figured out right now, I'm gay, and the cause of my life was same-sex marriage, which I was an advocate. But I'm also a religious liberty nut, and I think these things go together. In 2008, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints pitched in very hard to ban same-sex marriage in California, which was deeply disappointing.
Yeah.
And apparently it occasioned a rethink in the church, because a year or two later, the church supported an LGBT anti-discrimination law saying, well, we may not be for same-sex marriage, but we don't want gay and lesbian and trans people fired from their jobs. That doesn't make sense. But then in 2015 came the lightning stroke that first got my attention, and that's the Utah Compromise. And I'm guessing a lot of your listeners will be acquainted with that.
Yeah.
But this was the church, along with, after long conversations with Equality Utah, which is the LGBT group in the state, and conservative Republicans in the legislature, passed a statute that created anti-discrimination protections for LGBT Utahns, paired with important but carefully defined religious liberty exemptions for people of faith so that, for example, BYU does not have to include same-sex couples in its married student housing.
Right.
And the result of this was a transformation in the relations of LGBT people in the state and the church and conservatives and Republicans. It created new channels of communication and trust, which if you talk to Troy Williams, who's the head of Equality Utah, who I saw 3 weeks ago in Salt Lake City, he will tell you this has been transformative of the culture, not just the law. So now that got my attention. We did a whole forum about it. In Brookings, where I work, we brought in Governor Levitt and some people to talk about, could this be replicated? But what's going on here? So now fast forward, it's 2021, and President Oaks gives a speech at the University of Virginia, and that's the second lightning flash.
Huh.
Someone brings this to my attention, and I read it, and the hair stands up on the back of my neck because I feel like this is the message that I have been looking for. This is the combination of the teachings of Jesus Christ and James Madison that fully understands that they're on the same page and that the church has some obligation to both. And what President Oaks says, he lays out the whole framework for this. Everyone should read the speech. It's a thing of beauty. But what he says is that he comes not as a lawyer, which he is. He's a deeply informed scholar of the Constitution. But he says he comes as an apostle of Jesus Christ, and his message is that the way Jesus Christ wants Christians to engage in the public sector, this is not just their personal lives, it's not how you respond when your neighbor's house burns down. This is in the civic realm, it's like social media and politics, is by pursuing the path, he says, of patience, negotiation, and mutual accommodation, the latter also known, he doesn't use the word as compromise. Patience, negotiation, and mutual accommodation. And he says, through that route, we don't have to give up our basic principles, nor do we have to give up our virtues, because, he says, patience, negotiation, and mutual accommodation are themselves a Christian virtue. But he says what we can do with that is expand the space to live together, find solutions that are positive sum in nature, like what the church did in 2015, and then what it would turn around and do again in an even more dramatic way in the U.S. Congress in 2020. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints helped put through a bill that enshrined my same-sex marriage in federal law in case the Supreme Court ever changes its mind, in conjunction with some very important, I think, landmark protections so that people of faith, organizations of faith, will not ever be pressured by the U.S. government to recognize same-sex marriages if they don't want to. It's a beautiful thing because it expands the space for my marriage and for me to live without fear, while also expanding the space for the Latter-day Saints and every other organized religion to go their separate way if that's what they choose to do. And that was done with the positive vote of every single Democrat in Congress, as well as many Republicans. Okay, so I look at all this and I say, what's going on? And I realized, I started looking into church theology. And of course, I went to spend a week in Salt Lake City and interviewed people, both church leaders and ordinary people. And I attended sessions at Sunday school and seminary in Utah and here in the D.C. area. And I read the works of Terrell and Fiona Gibbons, who were major theological thinkers. So what the church has done is fill the biggest gap in Christianity today, and that's the gap of what I call civic theology. And that's this question of how does Jesus Christ want us to behave in the public world, the world of politics and social media? Evangelical white Protestantism does not have any answer to that. They haven't tackled that problem, and into that vacuum has rushed all kinds of bad behaviors, trolling and demonizing and polarizing and all the other things that you see so many Christians behaving in. Latter-day Saints have filled that gap with this civic theology. And so I look to that as an inspiration for the direction that I hope Christianity would go, not meaning that other Christians need to become Mormons. That's not what I'm saying. And I realize a lot of evangelicals, probably most of them, don't even consider Mormons to be Christians, a debate that wild horses could not get me to talk about. But all I'm saying is that the peacemaking role that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has adopted, and the reasons for it, which is that doing this brings the church closer to the teachings of Jesus, as well as closer to the teachings of the Constitution. Everyone who's a Christian can take inspiration from that.
Can I want to ask you about some specifics that you write about the LDS Church's civic theology. But I wanted to back up and give you a chance to kind of respond to what I think is, and you probably have already heard it, something of a contrast and a pushback to President Oaks, for one, and some of the ideals of Mormonism as it relates to homosexuality and other things. Surely you've heard that Oaks is thought of as quite a doctrinaire figure around here, and that he's really been sort of the spokesman for the church when talking about certain things like gender being, just two genders being an essential part of the plan of salvation. That's Mormon doctrine. There's nothing, that would keep him from not doing that. Talking about how changing sexual orientation, is not part of God's plan. He's just quite conservative. And I think also the idea that Latter-day Saints are somehow above evangelicals or different from evangelicals in the way they think about Donald Trump, for example. 72% of Latter-day Saint voters went for Donald Trump in Utah, for example. We got 64% of the vote from all Latter-day Saints. That's quite up there. So how do you respond to that, I guess, that pushback that I'm guessing you hear from time to time?
Yeah, sure. Well, the first thing to say is 64% of all Latter-day Saints went for President Trump. That's versus 82% of white evangelicals.
Yeah.
And that's actually a big difference. And there's a huge difference in how their churches are approaching the world, because everything I just described that Latter-day Saint Church is doing is very, very different from the path that the white evangelical church is taking, which is a lot of fear, a lot of no compromise, culture war, fight, fight, fight. We're in danger, we're in trouble, all of that. So, yeah, I am well aware of the church's teaching on homosexuality, and I think it's wrong and very harmful. I think I can share this. I did have an occasion to visit with President Oaks several weeks ago, and I told him that if God hears the prayers of an atheist, then I'm praying for a revelation that the church's doctrine on this important point will change. And his response, he smiled and said, "Praying is always a good thing to do."
Don't hold your breath.
I'm not holding my breath.
Yeah.
So the point of this book is not that I agree with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Right. I think one of its big teachings is inhumane and unchristlike. And nonetheless, the point here is, how do we share our republic with people who have very different beliefs as theirs are from mine? And let me tell you, a church that is willing to say, despite its own ban on homosexuality and same-sex marriage, that it will nonetheless enshrine my same-sex marriage in federal law because other people are entitled to live in other ways, that's radically countercultural. Mm-hmm. That's countercultural in the way that Jesus was countercultural. It just totally cuts across the grain of our current moment. I should mention, in passing, footnote, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints were not the only conservative Christians who helped with that. National Association of Evangelicals and the Seventh-day Adventists helped with that as well, as did conservative Orthodox Jewish groups. So this is more than just the one church. But the Latter-day Saints are the church that have really elevated this to a point of theology, which really matters, because theology ultimately is, those are the roots under the soil that determine whether the tree stands or fall over and which way it blows.
Can we end the conversation by coming back to the message that you talked about to your friend Mark? It'd be nice to bring that to a close, if you don't mind.
Well, I'd be happy to. I always choke up a bit in this part of the conversation. I hope I always do. So Mark McIntosh, my roommate, and the co-dedicatee of the book, along with Tim Keller. Tim Keller, who is a great pastor who died a few years ago. This book is an apology to Mark, and it's a memorial to Mark. He went on to become the Reverend Dr. Mark McIntosh, distinguished theologian, an Episcopal priest, mentor, teacher, wrote more books than you could shake a stick at, and then was diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's disease. And that's about the worst thing you can get. That's the thing that totally locks you in. It deprives you of the ability to do anything except really move your eyes at the end. ALS, I think is what it's called.
Yep.
I went to see Mark. We had fallen out of touch, which is on me, but I went to see him in September of 2021, and he was in a wheelchair. He was breathing through a tube, taking drinks of oxygen. He was at that point still able to talk, but he knew he was going to lose that. And I remember him saying that he had performed a study. This was his way. He would study things. He had performed a study of all the diseases that it's possible to get. And he had concluded that ALS was probably the worst. So he wasn't happy about it. It didn't, however, cost him his faith. He said that he hoped to die quickly. He did not want to live into that part of the disease where he lost the power of speech. Speech was already very effortful for him. And that was the last time I saw him. He got his wish. About a few weeks later, he retired after lunch to read a book and died in his wheelchair painlessly. So at least he got that from God. The atheist part of me that's still a bit angry about all the flaws in the world that God supposedly gave us. I'm still kind of angry on Mark's behalf. Why would a servant of God like that be given such a terrible disease and be taken so young? But nonetheless, to me, he is an example of Christianity at its finest, which is not about joining forces with the government to exact retribution on Christianity's enemies and dominate the country. It's about the shining countercultural example of being very different from ordinary people and inspiring them in the way they live their lives.
Jonathan Rauch, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Jonathan Rauch. He's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. His book is Cross Purposes, Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy. Radio West is a production of KUER. You can subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. We're on YouTube at KUER 90.1. We're on Instagram at Radio West. And if you like, you can email us at radiowest@kuer.org. Our intern is Katrina Cano. The program produced by Benjamin Bombard and Tim Slover. Carrie Watson is our executive producer. I'm Doug Fabrizio.